All right, I will now hand over to Evans. Evans, I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes remaining so you can wrap up.
Thank you so much. All right. Good morning, everyone. It's cold here more than Dar es Salaam, where I come from. So, yeah. So it's a pleasure to be here. And yesterday set up a precedence that really could help us continue the discussion. Next slide, please, because I think that you've introduced. So Africa is known, I don't know whether in South Africa you have this and other countries, but we are known to make really great frameworks. And then we are also known actually not to implement the frameworks that we have. But in this case, when I was looking into this, I believe that the research really, the abstract was proposing that AfCFTA unlocks Africa's critical minerals for inclusive industrialization. I believe that it talks about diversity, it talks about inclusion, but also it talks about the intertrade between African countries. Yet we are actually faced with weak governance risks in the face of a plethora of policies that are being made and policies. But then the research really proposes harmonized policies, transparency, and stakeholder inclusion. When you go into the meetings that we go to, whether you are at the African Minerals Development Centers meetings under the AU, there is that issue about lack of inclusion of communities. But then the question, the problem is that even though we have AfCFTA, there is a problem with fragmented regulations. There is a lot of corruption that is being talked about, especially when we talk about managing African resources, but also the participation, lack of participation of communities, which obviously hinders that. Now, the main question that we're asking is how can strengthen governance frameworks under AfCFTA ensure sustainable resource governance in Africa? And then the objective of the research is to deliver actionable governance strategies to align AfCFTA's mineral wealth with sustainable development goals. Quickly, the key elements that the research found is that obviously there is a huge potential because AfCFTA unites 54 African countries, and as we had over 40 countries in Africa have ratified the protocol. And also it targets 52 intra-African trade increase by 2025. And then obviously there is a huge deposit of minerals that are now in demand, critical minerals such as cobalt, lithium, graphite, that would actually create an industry that is going to bring a lot of trade within Africa and out of Africa. But then again, we go back to this whole issue of weak governance mechanisms in Africa. Now, the stakes for Africa's future within the AfCFTA framework is that one, Africa holds 30% of global critical minerals, but then there is a need for what we call intentional governance to ensure equitable wealth, environmental sustainability for future generations. Unfortunately, for now, when you think about Tanzania, where I come from, and other countries like Zambia, where I had the opportunity to work, the resources are actually leaving the country. And the people are remaining poor and actually remaining with contaminated environment. So if you go to North Mara in Tanzania, if you go to Kitwe in Zambia, what remains, especially Kitwe, is actually known to be one of the worst hit environmentally in Zambia. Actually the dirtiest city in Africa, if you like, or in Southern African region. And then again, we always go back to this poor governance. But then when you think about the Congo, you think about the conflicts that we have in the Congo and in other parts of Africa, then you say that probably AfCFTA would actually be a place where we can actually think, rethink, and see how we can actually manage our resources. And that is actually over there. You know, what it does is that it supports, all the supports AfCFTA's industrial value chains, aligns with SDGs, but also there is also the this, you see, Africa's strategic mineral reserves in our countries. You look at DRC, South Africa. We have cobalt in DRC, platinum group metals, manganese, lithium, rare earth elements, vanadium, and graphite. And you can see our global share over there. And I'm actually rushing because I don't know how much time I have. So basically, Africa stands at a strategic position to ensure that our development can actually come from this new find wealth that we are being harbored in within our territories. Now, the AfCFTA has the potential to drive inclusive development and industrialization in Africa, but then Africa, as I said before, has this tendency of having a lot of frameworks. And I wonder if you know one of the frameworks, one governance framework in Africa that actually is supposed to have oversight on our resources. Which one is it, if you know any framework in Africa? One which is really known is the African Mining Vision, isn't it? 2009, it was adopted by countries. But then until now, only a few countries have actually ratified it. And we are not actually following the framework that we made, our experts made. And we go ahead and actually follow other frameworks. So the fragmented regulations are actually addressed within the framework or, the AMV. Harmonization is also addressed there. But then we realize that the AfCFTA may actually not align to the Agenda 2063, right? While we have Agenda 2063, while we have the AMV, Africa is still going actually to look at this, AITI, something that is outside of us. So we have been asking ourselves questions. Why is it that we are not actually implementing the African Mining Vision, but we are embracing the EITI framework, the Publish What You Pay framework? Is it because of lack of resources, or is it because we lack political will? So these are questions that we really need to ask, and we really need to find whether AfCFTA, if it really is going to be a tool for us to advance in industrialization, then we really need to find how it can align with Agenda 2063, which is our own framework for development. Now, barriers to sustainable down now is fragmented regulation, corruption, limited stakeholder participation, environmental degradation. Actually, let me just talk a bit about environmental degradation. One of the things that I see in my country, and I saw in Zambia when I was there, in a number of African countries, is that we allow multinationals to come in our territory, but then we do not actually pay attention to the environment. The environment. They come and take what they take. Our politicians, obviously, we have their part. Then the people with huge dams of polluted water. And this is a now, the paper really proposes a few things. And one of the things that I feel really interesting is how we can actually use integration here, AfCFTA. Africa is not integrated. I have 3 minutes. Okay, so we need to consider these integration theories. One is neo-functionalism, to make sure that integration spills over resource management issues. Resources have never been considered as part of integration. Trade is considered, but we are actually trading so much with outside countries. Just recently, the DRC actually signed a huge contract with the US, isn't it? So that they go and actually get the minerals there. And then there is the issue of intergovernmentalism that needs to actually be considered, that countries can actually trade within each other, but without jeopardizing what we call sovereignty of another country. But then there is the issue of transparency, accountability, community accountability, inclusion, which comes over and over again. Now, here we are just proposing what the AfCFTA can do. The Secretariat can coordinate reforms, policy harmonization, resource governance, capacity building, cross-border cooperation, sustainable resource management, and digital tools, because we are in the digital era now. And then I will go over that because I've said that most of the time. You can actually look at the research or the presentation. But then the other thing is, sometime 10 years back or 12 years back, we had this NRG, the Natural Resource Governance Institute, come into Africa. But then I just realized that we have IDEP, which is somewhere in Senegal, in West Africa, which also offers a lot of training for Africans within an African context, without actually bringing some, foreign ideas on how we can actually manage our resources. And lastly, if we are ever going to overcome the barriers, then this is a framework that we can actually work on. And maybe we need to apply AGOA style. As I said, Africa has worked on a number of frameworks. And so I'm just going to point out that we can use this within the African to actually promote intertrade and industrialization, applying AGOA style. And I think that this is just targeted actions that African nations can take. Again, continental governance frameworks, and the African Mineral Development Center has actually come up with a number of frameworks to actually bolster intertrade and industrialization using the critical minerals within the continent. And I think that I'll leave it there. And we can go into questions, because what really remains there is some speculation of what Africa could actually make in terms of economic gains when our natural resources, especially the critical minerals, are managed well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Evans. We'll go straight into the next presentation. So I'll hand over to Seutame Maimele, who will be speaking on Africa's response to climate and trade policies. Go ahead, Seutame.
Thanks. Yeah, so my name is Maimele Seutame. So I'm a bit late, sorry for being late. So I'm just going to be taking you through some, latest developments in the climate and trade space, and highlight, for example, how some of those policies will impact the African continent, and how, for example, the African continent can respond to some of those. So, so the presentation is based on various research papers. So if you have time, you can just go to the TIPS website and just type CBAM, I think, then you might get some papers around that. Yeah, so this is just an outline of my presentation. So just the first part is just to give you context, then highlight the overview of climate and trade. Of course, there's CBAM has been the biggest policy that I think a lot of people are starting to know about it, and I'm just going to highlight CBAM and a whole lot of other climate and trade issues. Then, drawing from some of the papers, highlight the impact of climate and trade, specifically looking into the European Green Deal and CBAM. Then highlight some of the key issues that have been emerging, and some strategic opportunities for the continent. So what we've seen, I think, in recent years is that there was a global transition to a sustainable development that has been going on. So we've seen it through various policies. For example, in the US, we've seen, despite that Trump is in office now, we've seen through the Inflation Reduction Act that was introduced, through the European Green Deal in 2019 that was introduced. And carbon pricing as a whole is taking a big hike in terms of, for example, other jurisdictions are looking into introducing carbon pricing as a measure for climate mitigation. So we've seen a lot of different policies that are being introduced. And what we know is that some of these policies have implications for, let's say, value chains, even competitiveness of certain industries. And in this case here, we've seen that the African continent has not been playing a role in that space. So, we have to start thinking around how we can position the continent in the climate and trade space. So just to add on the context, so we know that the continent as a whole, so as you can see from the graphs here, that there's North Africa, Europe, mainly they are called global north countries. So what we've seen, I think even now with Asia, is that their global contribution to GHG emissions have been huge compared to the African continent. So if you see, the African continent has been contributing less than around 3% to global GHG emissions. And of course, there's a climate vulnerability that I think also needs to be taken into consideration. So what you see, I think, from the other graph is that you see, again, per capita, GHG emissions or CO2 that is consumed by, households, especially in the global north countries. If you look at the US, of course, South Africa features there, is that they quite have a high, per capita consumption of some of these GHG emissions. So it means that a lot of people are using GHG emissions in their household. So, of course, some of these rich countries have been contributing. So I'm just building this context so that later on you see why I'm making some certain proposals. Then the biggest one, I think, in the climate and trade space, we've seen that globally, GHG emissions embedded in trade have been increasing. So if you see the ones in blue, which are negative ones, they represent the net exporters, and you can see, for example, here South Africa and a few other global south countries are featuring. So it means that they're exporting a lot of carbon into to the world. Hence, you see, for example, the EU introducing the EU CBAM. So again, this is one of the slide that I think the EU is using to say that the reason why we're introducing CBAM is because there's a lot of dirty products that come into the continent. Hence, they are introducing the EU CBAM. So, but we see that there's increased GHG emissions in traded products. And again, this picture here is also just the same as the other one. But what you see again here, China, the US, the EU, and if you look at the, India, Russia, for example, mainly big countries, they all contribute to, they have a higher share of GHG emissions embedded in their traded products. So that's a huge issue that I think even with the introduction of the EU CBAM and a whole lot of other climate and trade policies that are being introduced, is trying, they're trying to do, but they're trying to mitigate, reduce GHG emissions in some of the traded products. Of course, in the climate space, there've been a lot of debate, but around climate and trade, there haven't been a lot of, engagement or traction in that space. Of course, now I think things have started to develop in that space. Then, in terms of the overview, so what you see is that, again, the EU CBAM, as I've highlighted, is is one of many climate and trade policies that are being introduced. And in this case, you start to see that there's a forest that of climate and trade policies that are coming. For example, in the now we call them BCAs, as of course border carbon adjustments. Border carbon adjustments. We start seeing that they have been expanding in the UK. They're introducing it in the US through the Foreign Pollution Fee Act. So as much as it has been introduced through the Biden administration, now they are thinking of introducing the AfCFTA, which is more similar to CBAM in the US. Of course, there's Prove It Act, and a whole lot of other countries such as Australia, Canada, and Japan that are also thinking of introducing the mechanism. Then we know, again, the EU CBAM is part of a whole lot of policies that are introduced in under the European Green Deal. For example, there's farm to fork strategy, deforestation-free supply chain, and you'll see later on how, for example, I highlight the impact of some of these in the African context. Then, of course, another pillar that adds to climate and trade is, green industrial policy. So we've seen even under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that there have been, in other countries as well. You see that green industrial policy, whether it be through green subsidies or even other green industrial policy tools, such as, for example, tax credit for, let's say, if you're investing in solar panels and stuff like that, then you get some support in in that space. So we start to see that from a high level. So the climate and trade policy space can be understood from the border carbon adjustments. From as a whole, I think there's a lot of, like, let's say, green standards and also green subsidies. But this picture is just trying to summarize that. But I'm just going to skip these two slides and go to the impact. And I think here I'm going to be very fast. So if you look at here, so this is just a picture of the European Green Deal implications, the impact on the continent. So what you see, you start to see that most of the countries in the continent are impacted differently. So if you look at the European Green Deal, so there's a lot of, like, the circularity, strategies, the EU CBAM, there's the deforestation regulations, farm to fork strategies, and a whole lot of others. So what you see here is just, a picture of how different African countries are impacted by the introduction of the European Green Deal.
You have about 2 minutes, Seutame.
3 minutes.
You can start wrapping up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I'm just gonna run through this very fast. So this is just another picture here. If you look at mainly from mining and manufacturing perspective, so you start to see that the EU CBAM and a lot of other, regulations introduced under the European Green Deal, they affect different countries and industries differently. Then here in the agricultural space, again, you start to see that the pictures are not same. So in terms of CBAM, again, start seeing the picture is different for every country. Then in terms of key issues, I'm just gonna, yeah, so I know my slides were quite detailed. I'm not sure how I'm gonna summarize this, but I will try my best. So in terms of here, so generally, I've been saying this, I think, even in my talk now, that there is generally a lack of awareness on climate and trade, but of course, that has been improving. Coordination is still an issue, in the continent. I think even events, I think, mentioned that in passing. And again, there's also lack of infrastructure. For example, under the introduction of climate and trade policies, you're required to report GHG emissions or do some, let's say, due diligence exercises. So in the continent, we don't have that infrastructure. I'm going to pass this one. So I think everyone knows the story that the continent has been experiencing deindustrialization or lack of. Again, here there's a low degree of protection from carbon pricing. As I've mentioned, that there's been increased introduction of this carbon pricing. Globally, you see that these are different carbon pricing mechanisms that are being introduced. And in the continent, there's only South Africa. Of course, there's a whole lot of other countries that are also looking to introduce such, for example, in Botswana, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, even I think in Nigeria now. They're also thinking of introducing carbon pricing. Then another issue is that we've seen that African countries have been, they have high, debt, and also with that there's also high climate change vulnerability. So they are highly impacted by the impacts of climate change. So that also hinders, for example, the African continent to respond positively to some of these climate and trade policies that have been introduced. I think I'm just going to rush down to some of the opportunities in this case here. And I think events, I think you did also touch this in your presentation, but what we are highlighting here is that there's a strategic opportunity to invest in green industrial policy and regional value chains in the continent. So, for example, we've seen from events presentation around critical minerals that there are certain opportunities in certain value chains. So there's a need to start investing in that. Then the other one is to also go into strengthening coordination in terms of trade, climate and trade readiness. So in this case here, we're looking at creating infrastructure to respond to these climate and trade policies. So you see here, for example, here we're saying that there should be a need to establish harmonized MRV systems, for example, in terms of responding to CBAM. Then also the introduction of carbon pricing. As we've seen, I think already in the continent, other countries, they're thinking of introducing carbon pricing. So I know I'm going over time, but let me just, but I think, some of the slides will be shared and you can just go in detail. Then if you have any questions, or if you might have questions in the Q&A, then I might be able to answer some of those. I'll just stop here for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Seutame. We'll move on to our next speaker. That's Taahira Goga. And she's going to give us insights on incorporating a just transition mindset in addressing the climate emergency with a focus on green hydrogen production in South Africa. You can come to her.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks to the chair for the introduction. My name is Taahira, and I'm a researcher stroke engineer representing the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, more commonly known as the CSIR. Today's presentation is going to be unpacking some of the results from our social analysis that looked at the emerging green hydrogen sector in South Africa. And this is with the ultimate goal of actually informing strategy and policy to enable this just energy transition. So by way of a background, there's just a few statements on the slide in front of you. The speaker before has actually alluded to the fact that South Africa, SADC, Africa, in terms of global comparison, is actually one of the least emitting regions globally. However, we do know that because of the way of it being developing, it is becoming more significant in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Looking at the energy sector in particular, we know that in terms of South Africa's energy capacity, 80 to 90% of the national energy grid is actually, it comes from coal-fired power stations. Now, on the green hydrogen side in particular, it's important to note that South Africa is a leading producer of a few critical minerals, in particular your PGMs, and this is specific for the electrolysis part of the green hydrogen process. Another point to note more on the positive side is because of our large and long coastline, there's some sort of potential for exports that's already been utilized, and also our various ports. And then lastly, on the socioeconomic aspect, there's quite a lot to actually say, but the one I mentioned and the one that actually comes to mind quite often is the matter of jobs. potential employment opportunities, and the converse, which would be our unemployment rate. A quick AI search this morning told me that South Africa has actually gone up from its 20% unemployment rate since 2000s. The best that it's done in the 21st century is actually in 2008, where we've got the lowest of 21.5%. So it's been growing steadily at the moment. According to Stats SA, it's actually at 31.9, and that's fourth quarter of 2024. So in terms of the green hydrogen space, again, really short introduction. Where are we in terms of projects? So at the moment, there's 24 projects that are either in some sort of execution pilot scale or in terms of your short to medium term execution. The more significant ones, and I call them instrumental, but there's quite a few. You might have heard of the Green Hydrogen Valley that spans the 3 provinces. So that's Limpopo, Gauteng, and KZN. There's also Bokubai, Saldanha Bay, to mention a few. In terms of the various scenarios that have been proposed, the one that I've cited is where it has the potential to secure about 7%, but then going forward, you do see that it can go up to 10%, just depends on where our production capacity is. And I believe that was for 2050. So what is the framework that we actually used? And you might have come across the term life cycle assessment, but more in the environmental space. So life cycle assessment, whether it's environmental, economic, or social, actually falls under the life cycle thinking banner. And what is it? It's a methodological framework. It's a tool where you use that's used to measure, to estimate, to gauge the impact of a product or process throughout its life cycle or throughout its value chain. The social, obviously, I think speaks to more trying to ascertain the socioeconomic impact of a particular product, process, or service. And this is with the end goal of basically informing sustainability. In terms of a generic methodology that's used, first of all, you look at the stakeholder groups that are directly impacted by this particular process. So it could be local communities, it could be workers, it could be users. Then going a step down, you look at a particular social topic. So anything from occupational health and safety to skills development to access to resources. And then how exactly is this impact kind of measured? So what are the performance indicators? What are the matrices? It can be some sort of qualitative analysis, and I'll go into this in the next slide, or it can be some sort of quantitative. So in terms of our approach, at this stage, I just want to mention that the study was quite unique. Normally, this type of methodology is actually used for, so it's on a micro scale. It's for a current plant, factory, some sort of setting that's already happening at the to sort of gauge the status quo. Whereas in this example, it was more a prospective desktop study. So there was a fair bit of evaluation in terms of, okay, so these are the current initiatives. This is what's currently happening in terms of challenges and barriers. However, in terms of what's being promised, the claims, does it have any credence? Where exactly does it put it in terms of, is there going to be a potential improvement? Is there going to be a potential deterioration? Secondly, because this was, first of all, on the Saldanha Bay, it was a much bigger scale than, for example, a single plant. So you're looking at an IDZ. Or a municipality, and then we've also done an analysis on South Africa. So as I've mentioned, we sort of had to adapt the methodology as well, also because of our background as system and chemical engineers. So instead of going merely the qualitative route, so that would be just using some sort of reference scale, we also wanted to give some sort of analysis in terms of potential employment opportunities. So where are we in terms of projected jobs? Data collection approach, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. So the analysis all in all looked at approximately 40 resources. This is the hierarchy that we looked at. So we started looking at what is happening or what are the resources that concentrate on the IDZs, the SEZs, the hubs, moving along to what is happening in South Africa, the bigger overarching documentation resources. There were only 1 or 2 that really looked at what's happening in SADC. And then a lot of the employment factors came from the ARENA reports. There's some peer-reviewed documents and the such. So results. This is looking at Saldanha Bay in particular, and it's also looking at a particular stakeholder group, that being local communities. So on the top left, just in terms of skills development, it was rated positively because of the fact that there is evidence that shows that there are current training centers, skills programs, initiatives, etc. Mentioned the few on the left. However, I think it's also important to mention that we haven't really seen any evidence that points to the role of TVETs and community colleges. And I think that is important to acknowledge. On the right, a couple of numbers there, and this is more my colleague's domain, but I just want to mention 3 things. First of all, I think it's interesting to note that the jobs actually vary in quite a big range. So you'll see something from looking in the middle, 650 to 164,000, which is quite a big range. And this is because the way the jobs are actually calculated, we've pegged them to the production. So obviously, if you're going from 500 kilotons to 1.5 megatons, I mean, it's quite a big leap. And so that's important to note. The second thing is the skills level. So as you go along the plant life, you'll see that at the beginning, the former stages of the construction and manufacturing, 60 to 70% are expected to be low skilled. Whereas if you're going more sort of operations and maintenance of the plant, that's where we anticipate that it's more of the medium to high skilled labor would actually come into play. So just going to touch on very briefly the 3 additional material topics. Investments, so the renewable energy part or aspect in particular has been identified as a developing sector. There is potential of some sort of promise, and the prospective economic study also says that there will be some sort of economic potential if the sector does actually come to fruition. However, on the sort of other end of the spectrum and on the other side of the coin, it's mentioned that Freeport is actually only currently operating at 18% capacity, and this is quoted from a resource. In terms of community consultation, there does seem to be some progress in terms of there is an interface. There's also a skills and training committee that's currently in place. And then on the access to energy, water, and land, this is always an interesting one. So at the moment, it's difficult to tell actually, because there seems to be both pros and cons. There seems to be initiatives in terms of there is an approved EIA for a desal plant. Also, in terms of potential upscaling and oversizing of the plant, we do estimate that there could be additional energy that could be fed into the grid. However, the municipality is apparently already overshooting some of its planetary boundaries to do with water and to do with land. And then there's also talk of expansion of the IDZ, and you put that into context, it is a bit of a concern.
You have about 2 minutes, Taahira.
2 minutes, wow. Okay, I'm probably going to skip a lot of stuff. So after this is probably going to be the analysis of what is happening in South Africa. I just want to mention preemptively that we hope that the report will be uploaded on the TIPS website. This is a 28-page report. The base report is 128 pages. So there's a fair bit of text after this that I probably am not going to have enough time to actually go through. I'm wondering which slides to actually skip. So the presentation is going to be uploaded. What I tried to do was I tried to go through the sort of advantages and disadvantages or potential improvement and potential deterioration. So for each of them, for example, the skills development one, it shows that there are existing skills programs, centers, etc. It shows that we do have capacity. However, you wonder whether that link between skills supply, the future labor market, whether it's actually sort of fulfilled. One of the examples I just wanted to note here was coming back to the TVET college. So the well-cited example is that there's a TVET college in Uppington in the Northern Cape where we know there's abundant solar potential. However, there's not a single course that actually speaks to this, and it's not integrated in the current curriculum. On the slide, I'm just going to mention the second point, the fact that it's interesting that there are some regions in South Africa that actually have this abundance in terms of renewable energy potential. However, there are also regions, the same regions actually, that have a degree of water stress. And so you can't really look at one material topic in isolation. You really have to look across all of them. So as I said, really difficult to summarize a 128-page report into 15 slides. So I'm just going to skip to the conclusion slide, actually. Hopefully, in whatever I've tried to present to now, we can see that these environmental pathways, whether it's low carbon, whether it's sustainable, cannot just be viewed in isolation. They actually need to be viewed in the context of our or whatever specific socioeconomic factors that are there in a specific local context. There's a list of recommendations that are both in the presentation and also in the report, but I'm just going to note 3. So first of all, you need to align your skill supply with the local labor market, with future demand, and specifically looking at technical skills, but also your transversal skills that are required for this inevitable shift. Secondly, the significance of community consultation and community engagement cannot be overemphasized. And it needs to be a two-way process. So the community needs to inform the developers, engineers, etc., regarding what their needs are. And in turn, they need to be informed regarding, for example, what green hydrogen is, what skills are required, and their expectations as well. And then lastly, didn't get a chance to really talk into that a lot, but you would have hopefully noted, and I think it is implicit, that although you can do a semi-independent analysis on each material topic, they actually go hand in hand. So skills development feeds into economic development, feeds into community consultation, feeds into access. And so it's important that you sort of have that holistic life cycle approach so that you don't cause any knock-on impacts when you're trying to sort of improve something in a particular material topic. To summarize, the strategies that should be developed need to, first of all, enhance the opportunities that are there, but also we need to mitigate the inevitable barriers and burdens that will come along as we are undertaking this shift. And I believe that is the last slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taahira. Our final speaker is online. Nicola will be speaking on the topic of the just energy transition, considering employment opportunities in the rehabilitation of closed and abandoned coal mines. Okay, you can go ahead.
Okay, cool. So this piece of research, just to contextualize, I was involved in some work looking at methane emissions on coal mines, and with that, there various types, one of which is from abandoned coal mines. And so I got interested in looking at that. And so for today, we're going to look at just a little bit of introduction, contextualizing closed and abandoned mines, so then going on to looking at which of the sectors can support new jobs in the context of these closed and abandoned mines, and then what should be done, and then finally looking at concluding remarks and policy recommendations. And next slide. Okay, so introduction. So the just energy transition, as we know, it's quite a complex and nuanced and multidimensional topic, but it's fundamentally focusing on transforming South Africa's energy sector to a low carbon emissions, shifting the country away from coal. And fundamentally here, unemployment poverty should not be exacerbated. And so with the mine closures, yes, we're reducing emissions, but it's also a huge challenge for the just energy transition, because in the coal mining sector, there are a lot of people employed, approximately, and this is also quite centralized in the Mpumalanga province. There's quite a lot of research, which in the paper I've shared with tips should be available, but there's quite a lot of research looking at the kinds of people that are employed, also looking at the households, how many people they are supporting. And I mean, this is just the direct employment. There's also indirect in the sense that, these, so indirect in that coal mining, is procuring various inputs from other sectors, but then also within those areas in Mpumalanga, there's people selling fruits and vegetables to the mine workers. So the economy is very centralized around coal mining. And in the kind of context that half of South Africa's coal mines, power plants are scheduled to close by 2024, it's really important that employment solutions for these communities are thought about and we start to kind of move on these. Next slide. So that's where the question comes in, is that can mining, closed and abandoned mines being rehabilitated and repurposed, can this provide an opportunity for employment? And then thereafter, if they meet the just energy transition, the investment part of it, could they get the associated funding and support? And I'll draw on previous research I've done to look at the sectors that are important here. Next slide. So to contextualize closed and abandoned mines, so historically the country's placed kind of little focus on these, and there are a lot of challenges. So weak enforcement, difficulties. Actually, if a company wants to, they close their mines in the appropriate way, it's really difficult to get these mine closure certificates, and also to get the funding, which has been allocated. It's not like it's not there. And so often companies will kind of sell off mining assets just before closures, or rather place mines on care and maintenance. There's also an issue of illegal miners reopening disused mines. Not as big of, we kind of know, the gold mines, Zamazamas, that's not quite the same thing as coal mines, but it is still an issue. But even if it were solved overnight, these kind of more policy challenges, the actual process of rehabilitation is still very costly and lengthy. And over time, the government has become it's their responsibility now, because there's 6,000 abandoned mines in the country, and of these, about 379 are coal mines. And this causes also a lot of environmental impacts in terms of acid mine drainage, water pollution, land degradation, emissions due to spontaneous combustion, and this is also where the methane comes in, and safety concerns for the communities. Next slide. And so if you look at this, you can kind of see the mines. There isn't recent data, but the extent of the problem can still kind of be seen. Mainly here, it's a focus on Mpumalanga, but it's kind of dotted throughout the country. And so, yes, okay, this is a problem, but I kind of want to switch the narrative and start looking at an opportunity of job creation and of community resilience. Next slide. And so which sectors? So here, this is master's research I did, where I was matching certain sectors that are low carbon emissions, so what we want, but also high in employment intensity. And here we see agriculture and then environmental monitoring and services and industries linked to renewables have strong employment benefits. This also aligns with the Mpumalanga Green Economy Development Plan, which aims to transition the province's economy towards renewable energy, including biomass, sustainable agriculture, and tourism by 2030. Next slide. So in terms of what kind of evidence and pilot projects, there has been work done to show, I'm not just magically, making up that these things can be done. There's evidence that, with innovative rehabilitation techniques, land can be restored and used for sustainable agriculture, which was once thought impossible because there are a lot of challenges for crop cultivation. So there's been a water reuse project in Mafube, where they used a virgin land and they irrigated it with mining water, and the maize quality yield was really high, and nearly doubling those of dryland crops. The phase 2 beginning this year of that project. Then there's also the Waterfontein winter wheat project, where mine affected land and water actually improved the crop performance and had higher outputs. And, you know, they're doing the safety standard testing and everything was good. So these were specifically as Mpumalanga Green Cluster Agency, who've been doing a lot of really amazing work also together with Coltech. And they are also, this is very recent, have partnered up to look at repurposing mine land for biofuels, industrial hemp and renewable energy. And the industrial hemp is quite interesting. I was talking to someone at the Mpumalanga Green Cluster, and she said that the inside of the stalks is really, they've found is really good for chicken scratching. So another kind of use there. But what was really important in all these examples was that you needed collaboration between private sector, government, and very importantly, local communities. And so, yes, there are challenges, but with actionable solutions, they can be overcome. But there needs to be also more pilots to provide evidence, and these need the support, the regulation support, skills development, and finance. Next slide. So I kind of started to look at, okay, what needs to be done in these three kind of thematic areas. So in terms of regulation, as it stands, regulation requires that to rehabilitate land, you just needed to bring it back to pre-mining conditions. But here, a more effective approach would be to bring it to a land status where it's economically viable for local communities to then use it. In terms of where I mentioned that the money is allocated, government is also prioritizing asbestos mines and looking at safety and then restoring to natural state. And so this is something that needs to be relooked at. And something that's also important is, as I mentioned, the methane emissions. And this is kind of a low-hanging fruit in terms of the country's Paris climate agreements, because methane is extremely so if you convert it to the carbon dioxide equivalent, it's quite large, and so this provides an opportunity to reduce our emissions in that context. Then in terms of skills, as I said, community workers, there have been a lot of papers that some of the research was done by TIPS, looking at the kind of people here. A lot are mostly semi-skilled in craft-related trades and plant and machine operations. And so here, the reskilling is really important. But I also believe here the community ownership models and overarching support is critical, because, you know, how do you tell someone, okay, you've been working in mines for 30 years, now you're going to become a farmer? It doesn't quite work like that. It needs to be ownership. It needs to be working together and buy-in and all those things, which is, I mean, I'm on my high horse saying this, it's easier said than done. It's a lot of work and a lot of conversations and yeah, it's monumental. In terms of finance, as I said, government has allocated money to mine rehabilitation. It's about accessing that money, and it is notorious in terms of getting those funds and also the closure certificates. So another way is, you know, there's this JET finance, the investment program, which, yes, the funds are dwindling, but I see what could be quite interesting is looking more at the framework. So there, if you go on to the next slide, there is a framework in terms of, does a project qualify, and they need to meet standards, they need a report, monitoring and evaluation. It's quite detailed. And so, sorry, next slide. So there's guidelines with the Presidential Climate Commission. And so with this, it creates a lot of transparency and a lot of just oversight. And so with meeting these criteria, it could also open up opportunities for alternative financing. It kind of provides a sort of investor confidence. And here, as I said, it's private sector, it's communities, it's government working together, a lot of these kind of projects would have profitability aspects for private sector, for communities. And so having this visibility of how the money is allocated, the tangible outcomes would enhance transparency and accountability, and could create a safer opportunity for investments, and kind of provide some attraction. And thereafter, once these kind of projects show success, it could pave the way for larger investments. Next slide, please.
Please wrap up, Nicola.
So I'm wrapping up. This is the second last slide. So in terms of concluding remarks, as I said, hinges on proactive policy intervention, strategic financing, collaboration. We really want to turn, the destruction and the destructive environmental past of mining into an economic asset. And what's really interesting, I find, to think about as well, is one of the narratives of the just energy transition is about the movement of people. And with the mines being, you wouldn't need to move people. You need to reskill, create buy-in, but movement wouldn't be needed. Next slide. So my final slide is looking at kind of policy recommendations. So here again, we've split into 3: regulatory, skills, and finance. So looking at regulation, stronger compliance, strengthening government capacity to oversee the closures and then the allocation of rehab funds. Could be also facilitation of auctions and transfers of these abandoned mines, which are owned by the government, to new owners who have this commercial interest to then rehabilitate it, subject to, of course, regulatory standards. And then here, monitoring and oversight. Looking at skills development, upskill, reskill, and this is where, again, so TVETs would come in, as we talked about in the previous presentation, which is problematic because the TVETs, oftentimes there's a skills mismatch in terms of what's offered and what's needed. But this would be important, as well as training by government and private sector, and engaging with and collaborating with communities. Then finance, I mentioned, leveraging not necessarily the JET funding, but the criteria and the framework. And another thing could be, as well as, employment-focused incentives, so tax incentives for companies on an employment basis, and having these kind of private-public co-investment partnerships. And that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nicola. And thank you to all our presenters. We'll go into a short Q&A session. I think we'll start with a couple of questions from the room, and then we'll take the questions that have been posted on Zoom on the chats.
Hi, Alex, Germany Trade and Invest. The presentations were all brilliant, really interesting. So I'm going to come up to you guys afterwards and ask you to share them with us, please. The stats are really good. I have okay, that will be very interesting to me, because we often talk about how green hydrogen is the way of creating jobs, but we don't actually throw around numbers, and I think numbers would be interesting. And Nicole, right at the end, you were talking about upskilling and reskilling. Who would be paying for that? Would that be if mines have closed down and there's no person owning the mine anymore and those people are left there, who would pay for it? And then for the other one, would it just automatically be the companies? Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tabisile Sibelani from the Gauteng Department of Economic Development and Green Economy. So I have a few questions for you, Taahira, right? So we're also trying to implement the strategy, but from a point of Gauteng. And I have a few questions in job creation. You're saying that there'll be skills, which I'm thinking will be more technical. But then what is the insurance that those young people that are going to be going through these qualifications, that you will not then go outside the country and try to outsourced? Because I mean, green hydrogen is very technical and you need experts in that. The second one is, I didn't see much of the demand if green hydrogen is implemented. Where is it going to be going? Which industry? And also, every time we present the paper, we also get questions. So I'll just throw it to you to get a different perspective. Is it not a step outside of what we already have to try and implement a new thing like green hydrogen instead of focusing on improving what we already have? Like they're speaking of automotives, instead of being an assembling plant, actually trying to be the one to manufacture the car part, right? And then on the resource scarcity, we're already struggling with water as it is, and green hydrogen being the plant that it's going to be, it'll be needing a lot of that. And then my next question would be to Nicola. Just asking about artisanal mining, if they've looked into that, because already those mines are being vandalized and illegal mining is happening every day. Are they looking into that, maybe trying to formalize it? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Matapelo More, and I am co-founder of Mineral Insights, which is an engineering and finance advisory firm in the mining sector. I'm also standing here as the CSIR chairperson of the environmental division. CSIR is a South African institution of civil engineering. I'm also an MCOM in development finance candidate from the UCT Graduate School of Business. And my research is on the topic of the just transition in the mining sector, particularly focusing on catalytic finance in the exploration phase. So in the interest of time, I'm just gonna ask Evans just a question and extend an invite to Mr. Maimele and Taahira to join us because I see we just hosted a climate change breakfast in early this month in KZN, and we'll be having one in 2026. So please, guys, don't disappear. I'd like your contact details so that you can inform us further of your topics, and we give 45 minutes for presentation. So you've got a lot of time. So yeah, Evans. My question is, how can we avoid the resource curse if most mining developments and mining projects in Africa are owned by multilateral companies? So yeah, in your opinion, how can we avoid that?
I think we can start taking a few answers and then we'll go to the second round. Is that okay? Okay.
Thank you so much for the question, and apologies, I rambled a bit because I was hoping that I would be the second speaker, but I hope that we understood each other. Well, I believe that in the from the perspectives from the research that I carried out and the research that is out there, there's a lot of research on resource curse in Africa. One of the things is that AfCFTA is actually more of a gleam of hope when countries in Africa decide that they're going to harmonize their policies, but also to make sure that our governance structures are strong enough. The other component is the issue of financing. I believe that the problem that we have in Africa is that we don't have a financing facility. Let's say if AfDB came up and said we are going actually to have resource to support development of our minerals in Africa. So I believe that the long and the short answer is that we need stronger governance structures, which requires harmonization of our policies, but also seek to actually see which countries, like if you talk about the DRC, they have a lot of resources in terms of producing minerals that are used in electronics. Can we actually have an industry that develops that in Africa, and that we can focus on that? But I believe that it is policy, implementation of the governance systems and frameworks that we have, but also majorly the financing facility within Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, Evans. Seutame, there's nothing for you in this round.
Thanks. Just looking at the questions. So first of all, I would be lying if I could just give you a number off the top of my head in terms of number of jobs. I have a lot of numbers in my head, but not that one, unfortunately. What I did want to mention is that in terms of total jobs, as I mentioned, it is pegged to the production. So how much of hydrogen, or if you go further along the value chain, green ammonia is actually produced. In terms of the renewable energy tech in particular, so the stages that I mentioned, there's also some sort of differentiation in terms of whether it's solar, PV, wind. And then that is pegged to how many megawatts of energy you're actually producing. So those numbers are there in quite a lot of detail, and they've also the sources I mentioned in terms of employment factors and which scenarios they actually sort of joined with. In terms of the other questions, I suppose there's no guarantees in life. So there's no guarantee that whether you've upskilled or reskilled someone in green hydrogen, whether they're going to stay. But I do think the local context, there is some potential for green hydrogen. As I mentioned, the location, the fact that we do have the initiatives, the programs, the Fisher Trope, which is unique IP specific to South Africa that Sasol holds, and they're already producing grey hydrogen. So there are already projects here, and hopefully the skill supply can actually catch up and match to the labor market and the future demand as well. In terms of the industries, so this was a socioeconomic analysis, and maybe I didn't really touch on that. From what I know, there's the sustainable aviation fuel, and there's the heavy moving vehicles. And the form that green hydrogen can be transported is usually in terms of ammonia. So you will use the Haber-Bosch process, bring in your nitrogen, H2, and N2 gives you your NH3. The water security, I really wanted to touch on that because I think that's incredibly important in terms of a water-stressed country such as South Africa. There was a particular statement that was there. So even though I remember the words 9 and 1, but I can't remember the unit. So in terms of there being a certain volume of water that's required to produce a kg or a ton of hydrogen, there was a presentation by the IDC actually that mentioned that there's, I think, 31% less water that's required for green hydrogen production when compared to what's currently being used to produce energy via coal-fired power stations. But that is in the report with the proper citation and also in the presentation as well. I don't think there was anything else. Hopefully not. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Taahira. We're not doing great with time, but I do want to go through some of the questions online. Then we'll take a final round from the room, and then the presenters will give us very brief answers. We have a question from Lindiwe for Evans. She says, it's a very robust and factual presentation, thank you. The question is, who is listening? As most of the time, it seems like we research, we recommend, but the entrusted leaders do not pay attention nor attempt to implement. And a question for Seutame from Gillian Hamilton. If all African countries increase their carbon taxes to a level consistent with the Paris Agreement, that is $140 per ton, would we still be impacted by CBAM, etc.? And then Thulani Sithole is asking a question to all our presenters. What role can public-private partnerships play in upskilling youth for AfCFTA and green sectors, as well as lack of awareness and green border trading platforms? We're going to take Nicola. Yeah, there's also questions to Nicola that she hasn't answered. We'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll take answers. Nicola, you'll be the first to answer, and then we'll come back to our presenters in the room. Okay, sure. Yeah, you can go.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Sakula Kapuchu. I'm a senior energy specialist here at the IDC. My questions, maybe the first one is just a quick one on the GHG net export that events, no, not events. You showed us that color coded, and you indicated Zambia as a net export of GHG. Could you just elaborate on that? I just couldn't get it. And then with regards to jobs in the green hydrogen. So in the energy sector, we have what is called a 10 factor. So in manufacturing, vis-a-vis when you compare it with construction, installation, and O&M, the highest jobs are in manufacturing, then in construction, then O&M, factor of 10, like 110 per megawatt. But I saw from your numbers that the highest number of jobs are in construction. I don't know if you could explain that discrepancy. Thank you.
All right. Last question from the room.
Hi, Saul here from TIPS. For Taahira, I wasn't understanding the jobs numbers. It looked like 650 jobs to 110,000 or something. It seems like quite a wide discrepancy. What were your assumptions there? Is one of the assumptions that the technology is not commercially viable and doesn't take off? Or was it because South Africa just can't get it going that we have only 650 jobs created? Thanks.
Thanks, Saul. Okay, we're taking responses. Please keep them brief. Nicola, you can go ahead.
Thanks. So just quickly to answer the questions directed at me. So firstly, in terms of artisanal mining, unfortunately, it wasn't looked at because this is specifically coal mining. Artisanal's more with your kind of minerals and metals. Then in terms of who pays, big question. So my assumption, big assumption would be that the private sector would want to kind of profit, and this is an investment opportunity, and so that they would invest in the skilling, because this is a labor force right here, kind of where the work is happening. But as I said, there's also funds available from the government when it comes to rehabilitation, which someone needs to do and be skilled to do. And so it could also form part of that. Yeah, thank you. I think that was all from my side.
Who is listening? That's a really good question. I'm not sure if I have a correct answer for it, because it is a question that we are also asking. But one of the hopes that we have now is that within the AU, the African Union as an institution, we are seeing a lot of frameworks being made now, which really signals that someone has been listening. So we have the AMGF, that is the African Mineral Governance Framework. We have obviously the mother one, which is the AMV, and now we have the AGMS, we have the AMREC, we have the SADC protocol, we have the RIMV and APRIM. I think that this shows that now our leaders are waking up to the fact that we need stronger institutions in the continent. And the question which comes after that also is, will this be implemented? If the African African mining vision was adopted in 2009, and until now we have less than 5 countries which have actually domesticated it, there is an issue, an institutional issue. So we need to continue talking about this and advocating for institutionalization and implementation of the frameworks that are actually African by nature, and making sure that they work for us. Thank you.
So I have 2 questions. I think on the net of Zambia being a net exporter of GHG emissions. So I think we might need to, engage on that. But basically, the net exporter is calculated based on the energy mix. So for example, if there's coal that you use in your, let's say you're producing copper, for example, in Zambia, and you're exporting it, then that is, got to be counted as part of the, that contribution of, let's say, GHG emissions embedded in some of the traded products. So, but I think, we might just need to engage on that question. So it's an interesting question. Then on the 140 per ton, I think there are many interventions to respond to CBAM from an African perspective. So introduction of carbon tax is one, but just introducing it to 140, I don't think is an option. But yeah, so there are many options. So in my presentation, you might have seen that given that I had 3 minutes to cover some of those. So I didn't have enough time, but 140, I don't think it's doable.
I think the next presentation should just be focused on jobs and the methodology, actually. It does actually consist of about 30 pages, just going through the methodology, the resources, the tables, the employment factors, the multipliers, etc. So I'm going to give a very short answer. And at the risk of sounding a tad bit defensive of my colleague, I think we need to be careful when we use words like deficiency, if we haven't really looked at the underlying methodology and the resources that are used. So regarding the range, and I probably didn't have enough time to really discuss that, the reason why there's such a massive between, for example, like something in the tens to something in the thousands is because scenario 0, the way it was actually described, and again, sorry, did not get to mention that the social analysis is, I think, 1/10 of the overall project. So there's a techno-economic feasibility study, there's an environmental life cycle assessment, there's an economic study, there's a GH2 atlas. So this comes fairly sort of late in the sort of work packages, sort of corporate lingo here. So scenario 0 was, the assumption was that there'll be no GH2 production, but there'll be sort of 500 megawatts in terms of renewable energy. Then scenario 1, I think they call it a sort of, okay, in terms of the actual terms, 500 kilotons, and then it goes to 1 megaton, and then goes to 1.5. And then there's some sort of upscaling there in terms of production, the combination of wind, solar, onshore. I don't know whether it's onshore or offshore. I'll have to check that. But we can go into the specifics. I can show you the report and the calculations as well. To the gentleman from IDC that mentioned that there was some sort of, well, it differs from what was in another methodology. Obviously, it's difficult to answer that unless I actually have a look at what resources were used. But I know our numbers were actually counter-checked against some of the CSIR reports that focused on renewable energy power plant design. And we've used numbers from IRENA, there's RAM, there's a couple of other resources. There's the IBP projects that have also sort of given their annual reports and in terms of their jobs. So I wouldn't call it error, but the uncertainty could be in various aspects. And it's a bit difficult to answer that just off the top of my head without having a look at what context those numbers are, because any of us can throw around numbers like 1,000 jobs, 100 jobs. If you don't sort of contextualize them, then they mean nothing.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, thank you all for staying, even though we've eaten into your tea break. You can join us again in this breakaway room for session 10 at 10:45. And then that session will be on harnessing technology and reducing information asymmetries to empower firms. Thank you so much, and thank you to our presenters.